Well, last-minute obstacles threaten to derail the Iran nuclear talks underway in Switzerland, or so says one report. Remember, we don't know if a framework for a deal is even in place yet. The warning letter sent by 47 Senate Republicans to Iran was reportedly brought up at the negotiating table this week, and questions still remain over UN sanctions as well as U.S. sanctions that are still on the books. Gary Samore is a former chief advisor on weapons of mass destruction to the President Obama, and the current president now I've united against nuclear Iran, which seeks to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Gary, it's great to have you on the program. Let's focus on the goal here for really both sides. No one wants to see a nuclear Iran. That's the end goal, whether you're a Republican or you're a Democrat, or so we would think. Could this letter disrupt anything in negotiations, in your opinion?
I doubt it very much. The Iranians have known from the beginning that the agreement is not going to be legally binding, and the next president or the next Congress can decide to abrogate the agreement. Of course, the same is true on the Iranian side. But that's typical for these kind of agreements. They're political agreements, as we've had in the past with other countries like North Korea, Libya, most recently with Syria for the chemical weapons agreement. So they can work even if they're not legally binding.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that, because you mentioned North Korea, for example. There was a whole host of different negotiations that took place to keep them from going nuclear, and of course they did. So what makes this potentially different than that?
Well, we won't know until the end of the day. I mean, I think this government in Iran is committed to acquiring nuclear weapons, or at least having the capacity to produce nuclear weapons. So the agreement that's being negotiated is not going to solve the problem. It's a tactical decision by Iran to accept constraints on their nuclear program for some period of time, 10 to 15 years, in exchange for sanctions relief. Whether at the end of the day this leads to a resolution is something we won't know until the agreement is over.
I'm curious what you think actually will solve the problem, Gary.
Oh, I think the only way to solve this problem is a different government in Iran. And obviously we don't have the capacity. Unfortunately, we're not able to change the government in Iran. That's something that'll have to happen internally. And again, we can't possibly anticipate when the supreme leader dies. When he dies, what happens? So we just won't be able to know, nor can anybody know, what the future of Iran's going to be 10 or 15 years down the road.
But of course, a part of this negotiation is to hopefully influence some decision in some capacity when it comes to their nuclear program. When we're talking about this potential deal, we're only really using reports, Gary. So I want our viewers to know that we have really no idea where these negotiations stand right now. But what we are hearing is that the United States would, and others that are negotiating with Iran, would allow Iran to have the equipment and the tools to be a year out from actually having the ability to build a nuclear weapon. Why a year? I'm curious, because you've worked inside this administration. Why do you think a year is sufficient?
Well, it's actually not a year to produce a nuclear weapon. It's a year to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon at their declared enrichment facility. And the idea is that a year would give plenty of warning time, because the international inspectors are crawling all over that facility. They would detect very quickly if Iran started to produce highly enriched or weapons-grade uranium at the plant. And within a year, the U.S. would have plenty of time to go through whatever diplomatic traps it wanted to, and then, as a last resort, destroy the facility with military force. So a year is a benchmark for measuring the size of Iran's capacity. Right now, on paper, they could produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a single device within a few months. So a year gives us a little bit more warning time, and I think that's probably adequate.
And of course, that's all pending whether or not we're able to do the inspections that we want to do. And then there's the questions about covert programs that Iran could be sneaking around and doing. In fact, our own government, our own Pentagon, issued a report last year and said that our intelligence community's ability to detect anything inside Iran was inadequate at best and non-existent at worst. With those tools, then how sure could we be?
I think the covert threat is a much more serious threat than Iran trying to make nuclear weapons at the declared facilities, which are inspected by the IAEA. In fact, in the past, Iran has tried twice to build covert enrichment facilities, both Natanz and Fordow, and they were exposed, and Iran was forced to put them under inspection. So in the future, I think it's quite plausible that they would try again to build a secret facility. And the question is whether or not an agreement would enhance our tools, would give us additional monitoring and verification measures to assist our intelligence efforts to detect clandestine facilities. But the threat of Iran building secret plants exists whether or not there's an agreement. The question is, does an agreement strengthen our ability to detect those efforts? And I think it would, based on what I've heard about the measures that are going to be in the agreement.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. It's a big if about whether or not our ability would become better or would stay the same. Gary, we hope to have you back on the program. It's an important story and one we're going to continue to watch. So thank you very much for the time today.
Thank you, Jenna.